All right, Maureen's going to give me that 5-minute warning, right? It's good to see you all. I've seen already some familiar faces and many new ones, and it's my pleasure to spend some time with you this morning. You know, this goal of maintaining or improving memory in Parkinson's disease, it's a lofty one, right, if we're being honest. That challenge, there are many factors that for all of us make that a challenge, one of which being, you know, most of us are getting older, except for, I guess, Dr. Espay, right? He's holding steady, You know, the process of conducting and formally evaluating mood, memory, reasoning, and thinking, and then taking that data and translating it to functional recommendations, practical strategies, right, and a plan to build the habit of memory. That's the highlight, really, of clinical practice for me as a neuropsychologist. Neuropsychology, hope you guys can see, it's the study of brain-behavior relationships. So it's how changes in the brain, it's how the structure and the function of the brain affects what we do, what we think, right, what we believe, what we remember, what we pay attention to, what we ignore, and what we completely disregard. Right? And in that sense, in that broader sense, we're considering memory, reasoning, and thinking as behaviors. Right? And that might be a shift for you to think about it in those terms, but it's just the way we think of anxiety and depression, right, and motivation in our day-to-day tasks as behaviors. When we consider it like that, it's easier to see how the behavior of memory is helped, right, by creating this habit of structure and support, and it supports that functioning. The term cognition is something that is confusing to some, and I'll use cognition and cognitive pretty interchangeably, and so really just think about that as an umbrella term, right? So what a neuropsychologist is going to do in the process of an evaluation is evaluate cognitive functioning, and that's all these underlying domains you can see on the palette, right? So things like attention, memory, reasoning, executive functions, mood, motor. In an ideal setting, all of those underlying abilities work together in concert, right? And they inform and they allow integrated functioning. Now, our brains, we're pretty good at knowing when something is different, when something has changed. We're not always good at knowing exactly what just is causing that change. There are common statements that folks make when they come in for evaluation. One of the most common is, you know, I thought about that earlier, but got busy with something and then didn't happen. Right, sort of the classic example is, it's 12 o'clock and you're thinking about your 1 o'clock medicines that are due, right? It's 12 o'clock, so you're not late. You didn't forget your 1 o'clocks. But you get engaged in a task, you get busy doing something, and then sure enough, right, what happens? 1 o'clock comes and goes. Other things that folks say is, oh man, I went upstairs to the office and I just had no idea once I got there. What did I come up here for, right? And really, that's less of a memory issue. It's more of an issue with sustaining attention, right, and not being distracted on the way to the other room. But these are common complaints for folks with Parkinson's. Oftentimes, folks will have great memory of a detailed conversation that happens, right? They're engaged, they're in that conversation, but along that way, you just kind of lose sense, right, of what the end result was. Right, and folks will say, hey, I know we talked about that, but what did we decide? Right, where you can kind of get sidetracked in that process of all the details of the discussion. These are really common complaints. There's often a distinction made between what folks describe as short and long-term memory. So let's talk about memory, and we're not going to get bogged down here. I know there's a lot on this slide, but let's start with that blue box, which is short-term memory, right? Oh my goodness, it is short, right? Unless you are practicing like the person I saw last week, right? They practiced the date all the way back from the waiting room to the appointment, because of course, you know, as you're going to see a neuropsychologist, they're going to ask you what the date is, right? So she practiced it the whole time, right? And then I, knowing that and hearing that, asked her many other questions before we got to the date, right? But unless you're actively processing and practicing something, you've got, give or take, about 30 seconds. That's not that long. Right? That really isn't that long. And think about how vulnerable you can be to distraction during that time. We're going to talk specifically of some stumbling blocks that are present in Parkinson's. So some of that information doesn't even get attended to. Some of it, you're thinking about something else, right? When your spouse is telling you, we really need to leave by 8 o'clock to get there at 9, right? Some of it's lost to memory. Other is shipped off to long-term memory, right? We have long-term memory for things in the far left that are based on motor and procedure, right? So think about when you learned how to ride a bike or operate a technical machine or a tool, right? Or use a dryer off the tee, right? Most athletes will call this muscle memory. Have you guys heard that before? How many of y'all have heard that term, muscle memory? Good, because we're not going to talk about that. Right? We're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about declarative memory. And the way that I remember that, the way that I keep that straight is declarative memory means in some way I'm going to declare, right, something that I have learned, something that I know and remember. And that comes in two main forms. One is semantic memory. We're going to give some examples and have a small quiz, so hopefully you guys will be able to see the board. The screen. Semantic memory is fact-based. So think about school-based learning as one example. Where most folks with Parkinson's experience variability, and some of the difficulty, though, is in episodic memory, which is more event-based. So again, semantic memory, it's what you know. You really don't even know where you learned it, how you learned it, or what that process was like. Right? Somehow you've learned 10, 20, 30,000 words and definitions, right? You know word meaning, you know what a sunflower is, you know basic mathematic operations, right? You know what happened December 7th, 1941. Those sort of fact-based memories. I was trying to tell my son this past weekend. He's like, what do I do with the hose? And I'm like, Stephen, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. And he looked at me like I had two heads, right? So clearly he didn't forget that. He didn't learn that one, but hopefully now he's got that one in the bag. So that's semantic memory. It's unusual. So slowness in thinking, right? And if you transition to the off state and your meds aren't working well, it can mess with retrieval of semantic memory, but significant impairment in that is not really what we see most often in Parkinson's. What we really see is variability in episodic memory, and that's what you recall, right? Those are your experiences, right? Those are things that you have experienced, more event-based. So the memories of your favorite fourth grade teacher, right? Mrs. Usher, by the way. Or what certain things smell like, or what you did during the initial days of COVID, or the 7 things you need to get at the grocery store, right? What often happens is you've got 5 in the cart and 13 others that weren't on the list, right? Especially if you go to Costco, Lord help us, right? But you might miss what those other 2 are. So in that moment, right, you know there's a bit of a difficulty with recall. It might be, you know, what's that medicine change that Dr. Duker made yesterday? Or did I drop that bill that's on the microwave in the post office on the way? What you'll see, though, is when folks make that distinction between long and short-term memory, what they're really talking about usually is episodic memory, some of which is quite remote, right? Some of which happened decades ago. Some happened 20 minutes ago, 2 hours ago, but it's still classified as long-term memory. All right, here's the first quiz. This is a quiz of semantic memory. What is the state where the red star is? Just shout it out. Yes, Thank you, Maureen, for the summary statement. Yeah, Arizona. What about the Blue Star? Tennessee. Yeah, we're closer to home, so that's a little bit of a safer one. And what about the other one? South Carolina. That's right. So I'm sure there's some of you that if we passed out this map, which I'm not going to do, right? I'm not a secret fifth grade teacher whenever you learn that, but if we passed out this map, I'm sure some of you could write in all the states and all the capitals, right? If at 50 or 60 you don't know the capital because you never learned it, it's not a memory problem, right? You just never learned it, right? So this is what's meant an example of semantic memory. Here's episodic memory. Episodic memory is that memory of all the times you and your family stood by that Great Smoky Mountain sign and took all those pictures, right? That's that event in your life. It's that time in Myrtle Beach, I don't know if you can make me out there, where just a few moments after this picture was taken, we had to all be rescued by some bystanders and the lifeguard because the raft got, pulled out. Or that trip many, many years ago where you took with your family when cars didn't have air conditioning and you all drove out west, right? That was quite a few years ago. But these are all examples of episodic memory. It can be something that happened a long time ago, and it can be something that happened 20 minutes ago. What Parkinson's does is it really creates quite a bit of variability in the timeliness and the reliability of bringing that information up when you want it. That, of course, means we're talking about the influence of the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe. Right? So organization, planning, mood regulation, entering new information into memory and then finding it later. Those are all tasks that are mediated by the front part of the brain. Let's talk for a moment about the most common cognitive changes in Parkinson's, because you can't just talk about memory in isolation. Right? All of those abilities are mediated by the same part of the brain. What is very common is what's called bradyphrenia, which is slowed thinking. Most folks are familiar with the term bradykinesia, right? You guys hear and know that term. I always say, when we're going through the evaluation, that bradyphrenia and bradykinesia, they're close cousins, right? They usually hang out together. It's just the slowed motion, the slowed movement of bradykinesia is more observable. It's more outwardly observable. But usually slowed thinking is a complement, a close cousin. We also see difficulties in these frontal executive functions of sustaining and dividing attention. Well, remember that little blocks we started out with? 5 minutes? Maureen's going to tell me that's not my time. All right. Okay, I heard a beep and she looked for her phone. Remember that 30-second time span for short-term memory? If you're having trouble sustaining your focus and your attention, how much information are you going to learn and remember in that window? Right? Not that much. Not that much. And so these executive abilities directly influence how reliably we are in encoding or entering, retrieving or finding it later, information that we expect to know. Fortunately, with Parkinson's, there's a strength in what's called recognition memory, right? So we're slow to get it in, but with repetition, there's a learning curve. There can be variability later on in the moment in finding what you want, right? And recalling it from memory. But folks benefit from hints and cues. Right, that example of the grocery store, right? If you can't remember what the things are, but you're going down the aisle and you see it on the shelf, you're going to go, oh yeah, right? Red pepper, yellow pepper, I'm done, right? Or you're talking about your neighbor that you've met and you've talked many times, you're embarrassed, you can't think of the name, right? And your spouse says, is it Richard or Robert? And Robert, of course, it's Robert, right? That's recognition memory. And you fare better with that in Parkinson's disease. How are we going to build this habit of memory? Well, one thing we have to do is we have to have strategies to address those underlying cognitive changes. And there's several things that are listed. We've got about 3 slides left here, and we're going to focus on the most important one for each of these, right? Repetition is something, the importance of which I can't really understate. When thinking is slow, It takes time to enter information. It's got to be repeated. But it's not something where you say, we're leaving at 9, we're leaving at 9, we're leaving at 9, right? That's not really the most useful strategy for repetition. You get a little bit of idea what life is like in my house, right? It's not really the most useful strategy. What I teach and the folks that I work with and evaluate is we want this to be a collaborative process. This is not something that you do to punish someone and say, oh my goodness, I've told you this 3 times. Why are we still talking about this, right? It's not a slight. You're not criticizing someone. It's an adaptive, active strategy that everybody, cards on the table, agrees can be really, really helpful. So that helps you put the anxiety aside. That helps you put the discomfort aside. Some people don't want to repeat things because they don't want someone to feel bad, right? Hey, we know this is a vulnerability, so we're just going to actively engage and do the strategy that we know helps. And this collaborative process usually starts with someone saying information that needs to be learned and remembered. They don't just keep repeating it. What we want to do is shift gears. So now the listener says what they heard and what they understood. Right? They might have gotten one part of it, 2 parts of it, or there might be a little bit of a few of those details were mixed up. The repetition now from the person that's sharing the information, that gives you an opportunity to clarify and restate it. Right? And if it makes sense, then maybe you're going to write something down and have a single parsimonious place that you keep those notes, or a simple calendar, a simple note. If the conversation was, what time are we leaving for this morning last night, you might say, well, if we want to check in at 9, we'll want to leave the house no later than 8. So maybe I'm thinking, I'm making this up, this is my example, right? Maybe I'm thinking we set the alarm, we get up at 6:30. That should give us enough time. And then it goes to the listener that says, I think it's too early for us to leave at 6:30. You're not going to say, no, that's wrong, you're not listening, that's not what I said. No, it's time it pivots back to you, this collaboration. You say, well, I'm thinking if we get up at 6:30, right, then that gives us plenty of time to get ready. We'll be out the door by 8, we'll be there by 9. What you've done is you've exposed that person to the same information, right, in a supportive, collaborative style multiple times. And that's what we talk about repetition. What we really have to know, though, is that process takes time. So that conversation takes time. That step to clarify makes time. And nobody's perfect. There are going to be times when you're in a rush. There are going to be times when you're trying to hurry, right? There's going to be a time when folks get irritated and they get frustrated and they get upset, right? This is not about perfection. This is about working in collaboration with your loved ones and your family and your friends to kind of have some strategies that can help. So this is how we address slowed thinking, thoughtful, collaborative repetition. How do we address the impact of executive change? Well, the main one that I want to talk about here for a minute or so is what we call habit stacking. Right? Is that a term you guys have heard, habit stacking? Yeah, all right. We got a budding minimalist in that side of the room. Right, well, habit stacking means you take a behavior that you want to build and you connect it to something that you already do reliably, right? So oftentimes folks talk about how hard it is to leave the house with all the stuff you need. It just creates a bit of drama and hassle sort of at that last minute, right? So let's think about it. And this is that hat I want you guys to put on, that problem-solving hat, that style, that mentality of, hey, what's the issue? What in the world are we going to do about it, right? Because it's not a perfect world, right? We're going to know what the struggle is, and then let's problem-solve the strategy. If it's getting out of the house and finding all the bits and bobs, right? If the habit that already exists is that you come in and out of your garage into the kitchen, then guess where that landing zone is for the charger, for the wallet, for the keys. It's right there, close to where you come in and out. It doesn't matter that there's a beautiful decorative bowl in the foyer that was meant for that, or there's that little valet tray that you got for Christmas in the bedroom. No, I'm not going to pick sides, but if I do have to pick sides, I'm going to say functionality and safety, right? That's top of the list, right? So we're going to we're gonna stack that habit of putting the stuff where we automatically come and go. If you want to build the habit of not throwing the clothes on the floor, which can create a trip hazard in the middle of the night, and you're annoyed because the beautiful hamper that's 20 feet away back behind a closet is empty, what's the behavior that's already happening? What do we want to connect it to? Well, if what usually happens is you start disrobing as you're entering the bedroom and the shirt ends up on the treadmill like most people's and the pants end up over here, right, on the side chair, where does that hamper need to be? Yeah, we want to stack that habit because you're already flinging clothes about. So let's put that hamper there, right? It may not be ideal where you want it, but we're going to build that habit together. And that's what we mean, that process. How are we going to build this habit of memory? We want to be really cautious and know that there's a lot of things that can distract memory. There's a lot of things that can be a source of interference. If you've got, and we've talked about this a couple years ago, right? Anxiety and depression, pain, fatigue, stress, pressure, working under the pressure of the clock, right? All of those things can take or make a simple task that you know how to do well feel very stressful, worrisome, right, and difficult. Those factors can also make a really challenging task seem profoundly overwhelming and confusing. So we want to follow that lead, and we know then we've got to back off. Listen with the intent to learn and remember. You know, you all have known someone that while they're listening, they're really formulating their rebuttal, right? They're getting ready for their turn. It's not their turn yet, but they're getting ready, right? So we want to listen with the intent to learn. And I think bottom line, we want to practice patience with this process of repetition and recall attempts. This is not about perfection. It's not about having that quick processing and memory that you did when you were 19 years old, right? We want practice and we want progress and learning strategies that you design with your loved ones, right? If they're there to assist, to solve problems. Keep things simple. Keep things simple. This whole process is part of what we think about as an integrated approach, right? Are these behavioral strategies going to be the be-all and end-all? No, it's one piece, right? Medicine also has a role, whether it's for motor symptoms, mood, anxiety, right? Cognition. But your part in this integrated approach is also staying connected and active, engaged, and involved. And that's why it's so lovely to see so many of you here today. Thank you.